While he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?" When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this," and he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay your hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." The way Judas features in our imagination is pretty much only as the person who betrayed Jesus, his friend and his teacher. The man who colluded with the temple priests and for a payment of 30 silver pieces led them to Jesus so he could be arrested, tried, and put to death. The Gospels never really say anything about Judas other than references to his betrayal of Jesus. His actions as a disciple were expunged from the Christian cultural memory. So it's easy to forget about what Judas must have been like before that. He was, after all, a member of the 12, and like all the other disciples, Judas had responded to Jesus' call and left the life he knew behind to follow him. Judas had travelled around Judea with Jesus. He heard him preach. He saw him reaching out to the outsiders in the community and witnessed Jesus perform great miracles. All in all, Judas was a disciple, a member of Jesus' trusted inner circle. So why did he betray Jesus? We can never really know, as the Gospels don't say much about his motivations. All we can do is make a reasoned guess. Whatever the reason, it does seem that Judas, despite being Jesus' disciple and friend, had some misgivings, worries, or concerns about the impact of Jesus' message on his own institutional faith, because in his betrayal, he turned to the institution of the temple. Judas's ultimate action suggests that despite doing much for and with Jesus, he was never completely quite on board with Jesus' message. He was never quite faithful or full of faith in Jesus, certainly not in the same way as other disciples like Peter. The other disciples were full of faith in Jesus and his ministry and were willing to die for it. Indeed, the vast majority of them did later. But it is important to remember that even though all the disciples were full of faith, that does not mean they got everything right. You don't have to look long at the Gospels to see how often and how wrong they could be, but they were still full of faith, fully on board to go wherever Jesus went. The moment Judas seems to start to turn is after they arrive in Jerusalem, when Jesus began to provoke the temple authorities directly, when he cleansed the temple and chased out the money changers. It is after Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday that Judas seems to start to wonder what takes precedence, his loyalty to Jesus or his loyalty to the temple. Divided loyalties often make for painful choices, but as Jesus himself said, you cannot serve two masters. But rather than dwelling on the tragedy and hurt of Judas's betrayal, I think it is good to look at what his story can tell us about the faithfulness of the other disciples. Being faithful to Christ did not mean that they didn't do or say anything wrong. It did not mean that they never doubted. It did not mean that they never questioned their God. They all did, and the Gospels show us so. But what the disciples realized and knew within their hearts was that whatever they did or said wrong, whatever doubts that may have entered their hearts, Jesus still loved them and called them and entrusted them with spreading his gospel. The sad story of Judas is that he did not feel this in his heart, or when he did, it was far too late. Faithfulness is our response to God's love. Faithfulness is an innate, natural, and internal acknowledgement of God's eternal love for us and for all people. Love, as St. Paul says, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. What St. Paul means is that God's love for us and our love for others endures and prevails regardless of our sinful selves. At the same time, we should always remember that if we share in that love, if we abide in God's love, our faithfulness will endure all the crises that come our way. For, to use the words of St. Paul again, I am convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord.